Well, another Monday is here, and I hope you guys are already having a good week, even though this video is released at 12:05 a.m. And thank you guys for watching. Share this video as much as you can. Put likes on it. Make a comment or two. Let me know what you think. Well, back when I was working at the dealership, I saw a lot of Tauruses come in that whenever they'd come in with no fuel pressure, it was a given that it was a fuel pump, and I saw it over and over and over and over. And if you switch on the key and the fuel pump didn't run and the inertia switch wasn't tripped, I knew there was a lot of electrical stuff involved, but I would say, well, this is going to be the pump. And so repeatedly I had good success by just popping a pump in there every time. The problem with that was one time it didn't work, and so what had happened was there's a ground connected to the two wires coming out of here, and that both of those wires coming out of the battery on that particular ground right there, it was all chalked up and there was no current flow in there, and so that didn't ground the constant control relay. They called it the integrated relay control module first, and then they called it the constant control relay module. But it's a bunch of relays that are packed together in this one box. Ford was doing that back in 1986. And it was something that messed me around on that one, because even though I had put a pump on there, I thought, well, I could do the right thing and pull that pump back out of there, but chances are the pump, since it was so prone to fail anyway, would probably fail, and then they would come back and I'd have to put one in it for free. So I just left the pump in there. But I fixed the chalky wires and got them going anyway. It always makes me, when I was telling one of the guys I was training, he was a young boy that was just out of high school, and they gave him to me to train. I don't know why the dealership would give somebody that didn't know anything to me to train, because the only kind of work I did was drivability and electronics, and you don't really need to start your training there. You need to basically be busting your knuckles and doing brakes and belts and hoses first, but for some strange reason the powers that be where I worked didn't understand that. And sometimes they'd give me some laid off policeman from some small town or something that couldn't even change a belt, like I was supposed to train that guy. And anyway, I would try to make the best of it. But we had this Mustang that had this wire harness connector right there at the alternator, right on top of the engine, that was screwed up. Couldn't get the harness connector for whatever reason, because the car was too new. However, it was out of warranty because he had driven a lot of miles into it. And so he said, go ahead and get the harness, because if that's the only way you can do it. See, there weren't even any of these cars in a salvage yard, and that was a different kind of connector than we had seen on any other. So one way or another, $275 later, we had a harness in a box there. And the kid that was working with me says, couldn't we just cut this terminal off this harness and solder it onto onto the existing harness? And I says, well, yeah, but the guy's paying for this whole wire harness that he'll never use, and the integrity demands that we do the work and charge the hours. Like if we're going to charge him 3 hours to replace that wire harness or whatever it was, we needed to go ahead and go through with that work instead of just soldering that connector onto that harness. You see what I'm saying? So but anyway, he learned from that, and later when I went back over there to visit after I got my teaching job, he was replacing an entire wire harness for exactly the same reason. Well, this Navigator came in and said the guy said it had been bucking and jerking for about 3 months. And, finally the girl that drove it, her husband drove it, and says, God, my goodness, we got to get this seen about. And her dad was one of the instructors at college, and so brought it in there. We duplicated the concern. It wasn't hard to feel it doing it. They retrieved some cam sensor codes with a scan tool, and we decided to go ahead and get the pico scope out and scope it. Now, a normal trace looks like the one you see up here on the top, and with these, every time one of these little tabs passes, see these little tabs here, and these are inverted, you might notice, from one side to the other. That's what it amounts to is. And so you're basically going to see the things lining up like this. This is the way they're supposed to line up, just like you see right there. And you can count the numbers over here. Now if you hook your scope up, you know, to where you're getting reverse polarity, you'll actually get a backwards hump, but don't worry about that as long as you're getting a signal and the engine controller seeing the right one. But anyway, you see how this one here is, well, instead of being perfectly lined up like these were, this one here was out of line. That was telling me that one of the camshafts was out of time. Now this other one was not out of time. It was in time just like it was supposed to be if you look at it. But this one here was out, that yellow one there. So that's where we were. And so we pulled the cam sensor and bumped the engine over till the three-prong side of the number one phaser's trigger wheel was lined up with the hole. Okay, so we wanted this one lined up with the hole. We wanted to see if this tooth was lined up with this L with the arrow made onto it. It turned out that it was. And what that meant was this was not a cam phaser problem. There was something else that was causing it to be out of time other than the cam phaser, because we were looking at the camshaft that was out of time. The phaser was not the issue here. It was something else. And so if you're replacing the phasers and not the chain, there's this kit you can get with this wedge, which is very interesting to me because we used to do the same thing in the early 80s at the Mazda dealership on some of these Mazda pickups that had timing chains, except we had to make ourselves a wedge out of wood to shove down in there so that it would hold that tensioner so it wouldn't jump back out. And you know, if the tensioner jumped out, you'd have to tear it all down and all this. But if you could keep that chain from tensioner from moving at all using a wedge, kind of like you're seeing here, then you could go ahead and just replace the gear, you see. So anyway, that's what the gear looks like. So you basically needed to put a mark right here, you know, so you'd make sure that you put everything back in time like it was. And that one there, you'd paint this tooth, and then right there, there's an R on the other end of that. It sort of corresponds with this L. And so, and that's the illustration of where you're putting the mark and how that wedge is used. Let's see, this is the tensioner right here. And you don't want that tensioner to ratchet out so that you can't get it back in without pulling everything down. And so that's how you would do that. However, we were going to pull the whole timing cover off anyway. And what we noticed was there's these plastic guides on one side of the timing chain, and on the opposite side there's the tensioner that's pushing on another guide that's kind of curved that keeps the timing chain tight. Now some timing chains have had these little tensioners to keep the chains tight for quite a long time. Real early ones didn't have, cam in the block ones didn't. But this is what we found, and this is a photo of that. This guide, this plastic guide that you see right here, was busted up and gone. This is a piece of it that was left, but there was chunks of it all down in the oil pan and everything. We had to get all that stuff out of there too. But the simple fact was that's why this timing chain was, this camshaft was out of time because that guide was gone, and it was letting the chain whip around and index the gear a different way and all that. So this one here would get a couple of phasers. After all, we figured we may as well put phasers on it anyway since they're a problem. Now there is a company that makes phasers that's got a little block in there, and they just totally disable the system. And it's just like the GM vehicles. It's got the multiple cylinder dropouts, it basically there's Jasper engines will sell you an engine that's got that deleted so that you don't have to deal with all of that hogwash where it's trouble. But these are the tensioner right here. See, that's the side and they're all pressure driven and all that. Furthermore, you got to be really interested in how if the oil pressure drops below about 25 psi, you're going to have timing chain rattle because there won't be enough oil pressure to operate these tensioners. And there's a bunch of different reasons. I talked about that, I think, in another video about how when you lose oil pressure on 5.4 because the cam saddles are worn out and that kind of thing, you may have low oil pressure to the point to where you either need to replace the head or the engine or something like that, Well, we had some crazy other vehicles that came in while the Navigator was in there. This town car had a number 4 misfire. The Taurus had a underload bite at 45 miles an hour. This Tahoe came in with an intermittent no start problem, and there was a 2001 F-150 that had electrical gremlins. The town car's number 4 plug well on the passenger side rear, right there where the heater hose hooks up, was loaded with coolant. It was full of coolant and it was all rusty, and this funky fitting that Ford put in there to start with is not screwed in there, it's kind of pressed in there. It's got ridges on it and stuff, but that thing would get to the point after expanding and contracting enough to where it would start to leak coolant, and it would go right down in that number 4 spark plug well, and it would cause misfires. And you could get the water out of there, the coolant out of there, and blow all that mess out and put it in there and try to patch on this and make it where it would run okay for a while. But it's going to leak again. There's not any good way to fix this, although somebody may have come up with something that I don't know about. But putting a manifold on there doesn't take but about 45 minutes. And I think it pays about 3 hours for you labor, hour guys. So anyway, this one you might notice on the replacement manifold that Dorman sells is actually cast into the plastic so that it doesn't have the propensity to leak. I don't know why Ford made that other one like they did. So anyway, so they got 8 spark plugs, and they got 1 coil, and they got a manifold, and the Lincoln was back on the road. The Taurus, the only thing the customer said was it had a misfire bite, which we see that fairly regularly. But when I cranked that thing up cold, it wouldn't hardly pull out of its tracks. I don't know why he didn't mention that, because it was terrible trying to drive it when it was cold. And there was no need to go for a test drive because we'd already duplicated it trying to pull it into the service bay. But it turned out that we looked through the scan tool, we didn't really see very much. I unplugged the mass airflow sensor, and when it defaulted to its other algorithms without depending on mass airflow, then we wound up finding out the mass airflow was dirty like this. You can clean the mass airflow sensor, but we decided to go ahead and put a new one on it. And I've seen this kind of thing before, I've actually cleaned mass airflow sensors and had good success with it. But this one didn't cost all that much, and we told him what was going on and said, let's just go ahead and replace this. Well, one of the things you got to think about is, why did the mass airflow elements get dirty? This is a hot and cold wire thing. What it does is it's got one wire that it maintains at something like 300 degrees Celsius, and it's got another wire that measures temperature, and it measures the differential between those 2 wires. They got a little platinum wire wrapped around a little insulator here on each one of these, and it measures the amount of current that it takes to maintain that 300 degrees Celsius, because the more current it takes, the more air it's got going across. Some of them measure it in hertz, some of them measure it in volts. There's different ways you can do it, and it's interpolated as grams per second and this kind of thing, But we went ahead and replaced it with a reman. And so the mass airflow was dirty because of a used up air filter that was one of those aftermarket ones that shrunk and had holes in it, and it let dirt get past it. It's a wonder it didn't cause more damage to the engine than it did, but it basically just stuck a lot of stuff onto the mass airflow. So we put a good air filter in it. The fuel filter was so plugged up that you couldn't blow through it, and but that might, I always think that might cause damage to the fuel pump. But after we put a fuel filter on it, ran like a new car, and all that. Of course, we also had to deal with that bite. We got all the preliminary stuff done, fixed the foundation before we went up with the house. He had cracked the number 1 spark plug. Somehow, I don't remember if he had put them in there himself or whatever, but it had a crack in it, and this was the misfire that we got on the IDS, the Ford IDS that we had. This 2004 Tahoe had a hard start. It was a new frontier, more interesting than the Taurus, and it was a bit trickier. Now, I hadn't experienced a hard start yet. We brought it in, it seemed to start okay every time, but we changed the engine oil and replaced the air in the fuel filters, and the fuel filter was so old that it would rattle when you shook it. I mean, this thing had never been changed. So it failed to start. It would spin and spin, but wouldn't fire, and we could smell gas. So we pulled the plugs out, and they were soaking wet. And so we turned out that, we did other stuff to kind of home in on this. The result of fuel calculations, if you've got alcohol fuel, like E85, it requires more of that alcohol fuel to do the same job that you do with gasoline. Doesn't cost as much, but it doesn't have as much energy in it either. but the scan tool showed the fuel alcohol level was 45%. So we called the customer, and he drove the Tahoe. You know, he was the one that drove it. He never used E85. Even though it was a flex fuel vehicle, he never used E85. My wife's vehicle is a flex fuel vehicle, but she never uses E85. So our DTC scan showed a P0178, and that pointed to the fuel composition sensor, but when we chased that one, we were confused by a 56 hertz reading we measured with a meter on the signal wire, and that conflicted with the scan tool that read 43 hertz. And so you see, we got 56 hertz measuring it with hertz on the meter, and so the fuel alcohol content one way or another was showing to be 37% that time around. I mean, it sort of bounced around, you know, it wasn't always the same. And so the frequency there was, you know, 43. And so this thing right here, $700 at the dealer was how much this thing. We got a Delco one from Amazon for $325. And so it was pricey enough to where I wanted to make sure. That's what it looks like under there by the fuel filter. But we went ahead and popped one of those on there, and it took care of the whole problem. Now, on my friend's truck, he's got a 2007 Silverado. He was having rich codes, if I remember, and he never used E85, and his fuel composition sensor was reading wrong, reading a bunch of alcohol in the fuel. But on that, when I had my scan tool, that Summit scan tool, that Zurich scan tool that I got from Harbor Freight, is a tablet. You know, it's pretty functional. Didn't cost as much as, like $1,000 at the time. I don't know if they still sell them anymore, but the point is, it's a good tool. And I looked in there and found where you could actually reset the fuel composition sensor, recalibrate it back to zero, and I did that and took care of all the problems that my friend had on that 2007 Silverado. Now that was another story, I mentioned that previously. Well, on the 2001 F-150, with all these electrical stuff, the windshield tended to leak on these in exactly the right spot to wet the fuse panel junction box. And it's a laminated thing, it's got all these layers in there. If you ever try to take one of these apart, it's no fun because it's just a bunch of laminated layers of metal and copper and plastic and all. But you pull that thing back and you see this garbage like you're seeing there, you're going to have cross voltage going between circuits. It causes all kinds of problems, and it can be any number of problems. Instrument cluster acting, speedometer not working right, other things. Anything that goes through that junction box can foul up. So it won't always be the same symptoms whenever you have a wet junction box. But we went ahead and replaced that junction box and straightened that thing out, and told him he needed to go to the glass doctor place over there to have that thing fixed where it wouldn't leak. And but typically at the dealership, when I would replace one of these for this, I would actually take a really stiff piece of plastic, like from a laminating machine, and I would make a little raincoat for it, so that even if it leaked any water, it would never get in that thing again. And the thing about it is, the customer never notices any water coming in through the windshield because it's just barely a drip, but it drips right on that junction box. Now, I don't know if those are still giving that trouble, but it was a big deal back in the day. Well, I almost forgot about this one. This 2002 Nissan Maxima had been diagnosed by this woman's husband as having a bad starter. He brought it over there to us. You know, we had written up the work order and all. Because sometimes the starter that was on it would just click, click, click rather than spinning over. Well, whenever he brought it over there, he was standing there when I went to start it, and that thing spun for about 35 or 40 seconds before it ever fired up. He never mentioned that, but that's what killed the starter, was having to spin that much every single time they started it. And I'd seen this kind of thing before, and I said, well, it might need a cam sensor on one bank or the other, because on those V6s, if you've got a bad cam sensor on one bank on these Nissans, it can cause it to start hard. So we got the starter off, bench tested it, wouldn't do a click on the bench, but we scanned it and got this P0340. The cam sensor on bank 1 was the next move, but we had to spray wash all of this crud off of it first and get it cleaned up where we could get it, swapped out without getting grit all down in where it came out of. It was terrible. And there's the the two cam sensors that it has. You know, the left hand one and the right hand one are different sensors. You know, but because of the shape of the way the connector comes off. Part store arrived with a replacement sensor, put it in there. Maxima fired up so fast the crank barely had made a full round. It was like, you breathe on the key and it was starting. And we did some battery terminal maintenance and a few more simple checks, and we got that Maxima done, got it on its way. That wasn't even a big deal. The Navigator drove away, running really good after we got the timing chain work done on it and everything. But they came back about 2 weeks later and said it was doing the same thing. Well, it turned out that we should have put spark plugs in it when we put and it was stupid. I mean, it's one of those things where you say, you know, we could have saved ourselves and the customer a lot of trouble by going ahead and replacing it. We know we did work that needed done, but we didn't do all the work we should have done, which we should have put a set of plugs in it. And these spark plugs here, you know, they've got special tools for taking out the shell when it comes off of the bottom of the plug and all that. But I found out that if you warm this thing up pretty good, and if you can get an impact wrench on those things, you can snatch every single one of them out of there, because you got nothing to lose anyway. Because if you take them out slow, it's gonna it typically rolls this little crimp back and leaves this barrel down in there. We get all of these out every time we ever did these with an impact. We got every single one of them out. So anyway, we put a set of spark plugs in there. It ran like a dream. After that, it didn't give any more trouble. Well, this is the close of today's video. It's only like 22 minutes long. I hope you guys have a great week, and I appreciate you watching and hope you got some good information out of this.